Julie of the Wolves, Part 3, bottom of page 142. One evening, as she looked for a campsite, she felt lonely. To amuse herself, she thought of the hill where the White House stood in San Francisco. When it seemed almost real enough to touch and very beautiful, it vanished abruptly, for the tundra was even more beautiful, a glistening gold, and its shadows were purple and blue. Lemon-yellow clouds sailed a green sky, and every wind-tossed edge was a silver thread. "Oh," she whispered in awe, and stopped where she was to point the painted earth. As she dropped her pack, it clanged out a frozen note, reminding her again that autumn was over. The season had been brief, the flash of bird wings, the thunder of migrating herds. That was all. Now it was winter, and the top of the soil was solid. No blue sea would be lapping the shores of Barrow. Instead, the Arctic Ocean would be a roaring white cauldron forming ice that would join the land with the polar cap. She was not afraid. Singing her Armorock song, she gathered grass and rolled it into cylinders. With deft strokes, she chopped a hole in the ice-bound lake, soaked the grass sticks, and laid them out in the air to freeze. Hours later, they had snapped and crackled into ice poles. She cut the drag in 2 pieces, and, pushing the poles under one piece, she erected a tent. Inside her shelter, she cut a long thread of hide and twisted it into a snare. A snowshoe rabbit trail ran along the lake, and she set off to find the resting place of the one who had made it. The air was cold, and she blew her breath into the wolverine trim of her parka hood. There it hung and warmed her face. Armorock called, and she called back, not to tell him she needed food, as she had once done, but to tell him where she was. A lemming burst out of the grass near her foot, and she spun around to look for its nest and young. Not finding them, she turned back in time to see a fox ripple like a ribbon as he pounced and sped off with the lemming. She grinned, made a mental note to be quicker, and walked carefully along the rabbit trail. Finally, she came upon a concave dish in the ground, the roost. In it, the rabbit would hide from enemies or rest when not eating. She spread her snare, elevated it with an ice stick, and paid out enough hide line to be out of the sight of the hare. Flat on her stomach, she watched the roost. Minutes turned into hours as the pinks and greens of sunset colored the frozen prairie. Suddenly down the trail, ears back, feet flying, came the rabbit. It made a sharp turn and plopped to a halt in its roost. My axe yanked and caught its left hind foot. She killed it quickly and ran back to camp. The grass rustled and she turned around. Kapu! He was trotting down the rabbit trail with a leg of caribou in his mouth. His head bucked as he fought the awkward weight of the meat. Kapu, she repeated. He wagged his tail, took a better grip on his burden, and trotted up to her. He dropped it at her feet. With a skip and a leap, she told him in wolf language how glad she was to see him. He replied by dashing around in a small circle, then in 3 big circles. Finally, he stopped and wagged his tail. "Is this for me?" she asked, pointing to the leg. He spanked the ground with his front paw, leaped to the side, and spanked the ground again. With a grin, she reached in her pocket, found a strip of caribou hide, and thrust it at him. Caribou snatched it, and with one pull, not only wrestled it from her, but sent her sprawling on her back. Tail held straight out, he streaked like a rocket across the lichens, turned, and came back with the hide. He shook it in front of her, daring her to take it away. "You're much too strong for me now, Kapu," she said, and slowly got on her feet. "I can't play with you anymore." Shaking the hide, he danced, barked, and then ran over the tundra until he was but a speck in the distance. My axe laughed and dragged the caribou leg back to her tent. She cut it up and built a small fire. She skinned the rabbit, saving the fur to line her new mitten. As the stew cooked, the crackling cold inspired her to dance. She stepped forward on the vast stage at the top of the world and bowed to her immense audience. Curving her arms out, bending her knees, she hopped on one foot and beat time with the other. Then she glided and shifted her weight, gracefully executing a combination of steps which the bent woman had danced long ago at Seal Camp. When she came to the refrain, however, she did not do the dance about evil spirits, but improvised, as Eskimos do at this point. She told the story of a young wolf who had brought the lost girl a shank of meat and ended the performance with a kapu-like caper. She spun laughing to a stop. She was warm. Her blood tingled. Eli, she thought. The old Eskimo customs are not foolish. They have a purpose. I am as warm as the center of a lemming's nest. As the sky darkened, Kapu came back. He barked softly. "I know what you want," she called, holding a large piece of cooked meat. Kapu took it gently from her fingers that she could not even feel his teeth. As she watched him run off into the night, her eyes lifted to the sky. There, twinkling in the distance, was the North Star, the permanent light that had guided the Eskimos for thousands of years. She sang, "Bright star, still star, lead me to the sea." Hastily, she cut the remaining half of the caribou skin into 4 strips in a circle. Crackling open the ice in the lake, she weighed the pieces with stones and sent them to the bottom. Around midnight, she awoke to hear the wolves in the distance, talking softly among themselves, probably paying tribute to Armorak as they moved along the trail, she thought. Peering out of her tent, she saw that the star was gone. A cold flake struck her nose, melted, fell into her fur, and froze. The wind blared, the wolves called joyously, and Mayak snuggled deep in her furs. Let it snow. Kapu had known it was coming and had brought food for her. She slept until daybreak, saw that it was still snowing, and dozed off and on through the white wild day as the weasels and foxes did. That night the sky cleared, and at dawn she crawled out of her skins. The tundra was white with the snow that would lock up the Arctic till June. The cold had deepened. After breakfast, she cracked open the lake ice again, pulled out the water-soaked circle, and laid it on the ground. Using her man's knife, she turned up the edges, tied them in place, and let the cup freeze in the air. As it hardened, she stepped into the bottom, tramped it into a bowl, and then cut 2 holes in one side. Through these she ran leather thongs and tied them together. Next, she took 2 strips of skin from the water and held them in place while they froze to the bottom of the bowl in the shape of flat rockers. Then she stood up. Her sled was done. Working quickly, for she only had a few hours of daylight, she formed a tear-shaped hoop out of the last 2 stripes. These she laid out to freeze. When they were solid, she webbed them with hide, made loops for her toes, and put on her snowshoes. They crackled and snapped, but kept her up on the drifts. Now she could travel on the top of the snow. She cut the rest of the caribou leg into bite-sized chunks and stored them in her sled. Then, adjusting her mittens in the darkness, she took a bearing on the North Star and started off. Her icy sled jingled over the wind-swept lakes, and she sang as she traveled. The stars grew brighter as the hours passed, and the tundra began to glow, for the snow reflected each twinkle 1,000,000,000 times over, turning the night into silver. By this light, she could see the footsteps of the wolves. She followed them, for they were going her way. Just before sunrise, the wolf prints grew closer together. They were slowing down for sleep. She felt their presence everywhere, but could not see them. Running out on a lake, she called. Shadows flickered on the top of a frost heave. There they were. She quickened her stride. She would camp with them and do the dance of the wolf pup feeding the lost girl for Kapu. He would surely run in circles when he saw it. The shadows flattened as she walked, and by the time she reached the other shore, they had turned into sky and vanished. There were no footsteps in the snow to say her pack had been there, and she knew the Arctic dawn had tricked her eyes. "Frost spirit," she said, as she pitched her tent by the lake and crawled into bed. By the yellow-green light of the low moon sun, Mayax could see that she had camped to the edge of the wintering grounds of the caribou. Their many gleaming antlers formed a forest on the horizon. Such a herd would certainly attract her pack. She crawled out of bed and saw that she had pitched her tent in a tiny forest about 3 inches high. Her heart pounded excitedly, for she had not seen one of these willow groves since Nunavik. She was making progress, for they grew, not near Barrow, but in slightly warmer and wetter lands near the coast. She smelled the air in the hopes that it bore the salty odor of the ocean, but it smelled only of cold. The dawn cracked and hummed, and the snow was so fine that it floated above the ground when a breeze stirred. Not a bird passed overhead. The buntings, longspurs, and terns were gone from the top of the world. A willow ptarmigan, the chicken of the tundra, clicked behind her and whistled softly as it hunted seeds. The Arctic Circle had been returned to its permanent bird resident, the hardy ptarmigan. The millions of voices of summer had died down to one plaintive note. Ah, ah! Mayak sat up, wondering what that was. Creeping halfway out of her bag, she peered into the sky to see a great brown bird maneuver its wings and speed west. A ska! She was closer to the ocean than she thought, for the ska is a bird of the coastal waters of the Arctic. As her eyes followed it, they came to rest on an oil drum, the signpost of American civilization in the north. How excited she would have been to see this a month ago. Now she was not sure. She had her ulo and needles, her sled and her tent, and the world of her ancestors, and she liked the simplicity of the world. It was easy to understand. Out here she understood how she fit into the scheme of the moon and stars and the constant rise and fall of life on the earth. Even the snow was part of her. She melted it and drank it. Armrak barked. He sounded as if he were no more than a quarter of a mile away. Ow, ooh, she called. Nails answered, and then the whole pack howled briefly. I'm over here, shouted joyously, jumping up and down. Here by the lake. She paused. You know that. You know everything about me all the time. The wind began to rise, and the sun started back to the horizon. The lake responded with a boom that sounded like a pistol shot. The freeze was so deepening. Mayak lit a fire and put on her pot. A warm stew would taste good, and the smoke and flames would make the tundra home. Presently, Armrock barked forcefully, and the pack answered. Then the royal voice sounded from another position, and Silver checked in from across the lake. Nails gave a warning snarl, and the pups whispered in woofs. Mayak shaded her eyes. Her wolves were barking from points around a huge circle, and she was in the middle. This was strange. They almost always together. Suddenly, Armrock barked ferociously, his voice angry and authoritative. Silver yelled, then Nails and Kapu. They had something at bay. She stepped into the lake and skipped toward them. Halfway across, she saw a dark head rise above the hill, and a beast with a head as large as the moon rose to its hind feet, massive paws swinging. Grizzly! She gasped and stopped stone still as the huge animal rushed onto the ice. Armrock and Nails leaped at its face and sprang away before the bear could strike. They were heading it off, trying to prevent it from crossing. The bear snarled, lunged forward, and galloped toward Mayak's. She ran toward her tent. The wind was in her face, and she realized she was upwind of the bear, her scent blowing right to him. She darted off in another direction, for bears have poor eyesight and cannot track if they cannot smell. Slipping and sliding, she reached the south bank as the grizzly staggered forward, then crumpled to its knees and sat down. She wondered why he was not in hibernation. The wolves had been sleeping all day. They could have not wakened the bear. She sniffed the air to try to smell the cause, but only odorless ice crystals stung her nose. The pack kept harassing the sleepy beast, barking and snarling, but with no intention of killing it. They were simply trying to drive it away from her, she realized. Slowly the bear got to its feet and permitted itself to be herded up to the lake bank and back to where it came from. Reluctantly, blindly, it staggered before the wolves. Occasionally it stood up like a giant, but mostly it roared in the agony of sleepiness. Yapping, barking, darting, the wolves drove the grizzly far out on the tundra. Finally, they veered away and, breaking into a joyous gallop, dashed over the snow and out of sight. Their duty done, they were running, not to hunt, not to kill, but simply for fun. Max was trembling. She had not realized the size and ferocity of the dark bear of the north, who was called grizzly inland and brown bear along the coasts. Ursus arcticus. Large ones, like the grizzly her wolves had driven away, weighed over 1,000 pounds and stood 9 feet tall when they reared. Mayax wiped a bead of perspiration from her forehead. Had he come upon her tent with one curious sweep of his paw, he would have snuffed out her life while she slept. Armrock, Nails, Kapu, she called. I thank you. I thank you. As she packed to travel on, she thought about her escorts. Wolves did not like civilization. Where they had once dwelled all over North America, they now lived in remote parts of Canada, in only 2 of the lower 48 states, and in the wilderness of Alaska. Even the roadless North Slope had fewer wolves than it did before the Gussiks erected their military bases and brought airplanes, snowmobiles, electricity, and jeeps to the Arctic. As she thought about the Gussick, she suddenly knew why the brown bear was awake. The Americans' hunting season had begun. Her wolves were in danger. The Gussick paid to shoot them. A man who brought in the left ear of a wolf to the warden was rewarded with a bounty of $50. The bounty was evil to the old men at Seal Camp, for it encouraged killing for money rather than need. Capagon considered the bounty the Gussick's way of deciding that the Armorocks could not live on this earth anymore. And no men have that right, he would say. When the wolves are gone, there will be too many caribou grazing the grass, and the lemmings will starve. Without the lemmings, the foxes and birds and weasels will die. Their passing will end smaller lives upon which even man depends, whether he knows it or not, and the top of the world will pass into silence. My ex was worried. The oil drum she had seen when the scuff flew over marked the beginning of civilization and the end of the wilderness. She must warn her pack of the danger ahead. She had learned to say many things to them, but now, the most important of all, the ear twist or bark that would turn them back, she did not know. How, she thought, do I shout, "Go away, go far, far away"? She sang, "Go away, royal wolf, go away, do not follow. I'm a gun at your head when I pass the oil drum." Threads of clouds spun up from the earth and trailed across the tundra. They marked the beginning of a whiteout. My ex changed her plans to travel that night, crept into her shelter, and watched the air turn white as the snow arose from the ground and hung all around her. She closed her tent flap and looked out at her pot. In it, she put a piece of fat from the bladder bag and a scrap of sinew. She lit the sinew, and a flame illuminated her tiny home. She took out the comb. As she carved, she saw that it was not a comb at all, but Armorock. The teeth were his legs, the handle his head. He was waiting to be released from the bone. Surprised to see him, she carved carefully for hours, and finally she let him out. His neck was arched, his head and tail were lifted. Even his ears had a message. "I love you," they said. A bird called faintly in the darkness. My ex wondered what kind it was and what it was doing so far north of the state. Too sleepy to think, she unlaced her boots, undressed, and folded her clothes. The bird called from the edge of her sleeping skin. Holding her candle above her head, she crept toward the door and peered into the bright eyes of a golden plover. He was young, for he wore the splotched plumage of the juvenile and still had trace of baby yellow around his beak. He slumped against her shins. Gently, she slipped her hand under his feet, picked him up, and brought him close to her. His back and gold feathers gleamed in the spluttering light. She never beheld a plover so closely, and now understood why Capagon had called them the spirit of the birds. The plover's golden eye and red noseband made it look like one of the dancers in the bladder feast. "You are lost," she said. "You should be far from here, perhaps in Labrador, perhaps even in your winter home in the plains of Argentina. And so you are dying. You need insects and meat, but I am so glad you're here." Then she added, "I shall call you Turnit, the bird spirit." She eased the bird inside her warm sleeping skin, cut off a piece of caribou meat, and held it out. Turnit ate ravenously, then rested. She fed him once more, and then he tucked his head in his back feathers and went to sleep. The following night, the whiteout was still so dense she could not see the ground when she crept out for snow to melt and drink. "I won't go on tonight," she said to Turnit when she came inside, "but I do not care. I have food, light, furs, fire, and a pretty companion." That evening she polished her carving of Armorock and talked to Turnit. The plover was incredibly tame, perhaps because he lived in the most barren parts of the world where there were no people, perhaps because he was lonely. Turnit ran over her skins, flitted to her head and shoulders, and sang when she sang. On the next afternoon, the whiteout was but a frosty mist. Myax was cooking dinner when Turnit drew his feathers to his body and stood up in alarm. She listened for a long time before she heard the snow screams as footsteps passed it. Scrambling to the door, she saw Capu in the mist, frost on his whiskers. "Hi," she called. He did not turn around, for he was looking at something in the distance. Presently, Armorock swept into view and stopped beside him. "Armorock," she shouted, Armorak, how are you?" Tossing her head in wolf happiness, she crawled out of her tent on all fours and nudged him under the chin. He arched his neck grandly. Then, with a glance at Kapu, he ran out on the lake. The young wolf followed, and laughing joyously, Mayax crawled after them both. She had not gone far before Amarak stopped and glared at her. She stayed where she was. The regal pair leapt away, snow billowing up from their strides like smoke. Getting to her knees, she looked for silver nails in the other pups, but they did not follow the pair. Mayax rocked back on her heels. Could it be that the leader of the pack was teaching the leader of the pups? She nodded slowly as she comprehended. Of course, to be a leader required not only fearlessness and intelligence, but experience and schooling. The head of a wolf pack needed to be trained, and who better to do this than Armorak? "And I know what you'll teach," she called out. "You'll teach him which animal to harvest. You'll teach him to make all decisions. You'll teach him how to close in on caribou and where to bed the wolf pack down, and you'll teach him to love and protect." The whiteout vanished, the stars blazed out, and San Francisco called to Mayax. It was time to move on. Kapu was now in school. "But how should I tell them not to follow me anymore?" she asked Hermit as she crawled back to her tent. "Of course," she gasped. She had been told by Armorak herself to stay back when he had wanted Kapu alone. He had walked forward, turned around, and glared into her eyes. She had stopped in her tracks and gone home. Eagerly she practiced. She ran forward, looked over her shoulder, and glared. "Stay, Armorak. Stay where you are." Humming to herself, she took down her tent, rolled it into a bundle, and threw it on the new sled. Then she stuffed her pack and tucked Turnit in the hood of her parka. Sticking her toes in the snowshoes, she took a bearing on the constant star. The snow squeaked under her feet, and for the first time she felt the dry bite of the cold right through her parka and boots. To her, this meant the temperature was 0, the point every year when she began to feel chilly. Dancing and swinging her arms to get warm, she picked up the thongs of her sled and walked toward the sea. The sled glided lightly behind her.